Hello everybody and welcome to the Winecast. I'm getting ready to do some traveling and won't be where I can easily cast for a couple of weeks. So I wanted to get one more cast in before I'm off, and since my stuff's not going to pack itself, it'll have to be a brief one. I thought I'd take just a few minutes to say a little about vintage, something that you hear about all the time in the wine world, but that nevertheless doesn't always get the full exploration that it deserves. So here's a quick attempt in that direction that we can build on in future casts. Though there are actually a couple of different ways that the word vintage can be used, the one you're most likely to run into is just a statement of the year that the grapes, or at least most of the grapes that the wine with the vintage designation is made from, were harvested. The real emphasis, though, isn't on the harvest, but it's on the year during which the grapes went through their development cycle, a process that usually runs from mid-spring to mid-autumn. In the Northern Hemisphere, where the concept of vintage was originally developed and worked out, both of these, grape development and harvest, happen in the same calendar year. And in cases where there's an exception, such as grapes meant to be made into ice wine that are left on the vine to freeze and sometimes aren't harvested until January of the following year, the vintage date references the year that grape development took place in rather than the technical date of harvest. In the Southern Hemisphere, though, things get slightly complicated because of the fact that the time between mid-spring to mid-autumn is divided between 2 calendar years, with a fair amount of the grape development taking place in the first of those 2 years. In this case, vintage designation is assigned to the year in which the grapes were harvested. So just to give an example, if the grapes for a particular Southern Hemisphere wine started growing in September of 2016, but were harvested in March of 2017, the vintage for that wine is 2017. Though there's no requirement to designate a wine with a vintage, if a producer does so, different wine-producing countries will have different regulations for what the minimum amount of wine from the vintage year must be. In Chile and South Africa, the minimum is 75%, meaning that if a vintage designation appears on a Chilean or South African bottle, at least 75% of the wine in the bottle was made from the grapes grown during the named vintage. The wine-producing nations of the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States set the minimum at 85%. And in the U.S., this minimum only applies to wines with a state or county geographic designation, as opposed to an American viticultural area, or AVA, in which case the minimum is 95%. Though it may seem strange to award a vintage designation when not all of the grapes in the wine are from that vintage, the logic behind these rulings is grounded in what makes vintage such a compelling topic to begin with: annual climate variation. Since even in the same growing region, some years will be more or less ideal for grape growth than others, allowing a producer access to reserves kept from previous years makes it possible for a producer to smooth out a rough vintage by blending in wine from a stronger one. There is some ancient awareness of the concept of vintage, with the Romans, as with so many things in ancient wine, leading the way. Designating a vintage is really only important if it's possible to store a wine effectively beyond the year it was made. And the Romans did make use of some early technologies, including cork and the use of sulfur, that added to wine longevity and kicked off a culture of vintage connoisseurship that valued wines from a particular year, with especially notable examples being the wines of the Anician vintage of 160 BC, named after the fact for Lucius Anicius Gallus, who was one of the consuls that year, and the really famous Opimian vintage, named after one of the consuls for 121 BC, Lucius Opimius. In fact, wine-loving Romans took vintage so seriously that there was even a problem with wine counterfeiting. One section of the famous Roman novel The Satyricon, set during the reign of the Emperor Nero around 60 AD, describes a banquet given by a wealthy individual named Trimalchio, at which glass jars of wine labeled from the Opimian vintage were brought out and enjoyed by everyone. But by 60 AD, real Opimian wine would have been 180 years old and probably undrinkable. And there are also some suspicious details about the labeling of the wine that should have raised a couple of eyebrows. So even though the banquet is fictional, the writer, Gaius Petronius, is probably pointing out a very real situation in imperial Rome, which still happens today, where fraudsters took advantage of individuals on the lookout for what was supposed to be an excellent wine. As the Roman Empire broke up, a lot of techniques for wine preservation fell into disuse, and for most of the Middle Ages in Europe, wine tended not to survive for much more than a year after it was harvested, unless it was particularly high in sugar that acts as a natural preservative. So you'll hear about a few exceptional years here and there that were celebrated for their vintages, but only in limited areas. But it wouldn't be until the 17th and 18th centuries, with developments in bottle and cork production, especially the production of bottles in shapes that could be easily stored in a cellar environment, that a renewed interest in vintage as a significant identifier appears throughout the wine world. Along with this trend came an interest in rating different vintages for their quality, and in 1935, the International Wine and Food Society issued one of the first vintage charts just 2 years after its founding in Britain. Though free to take any form that their creator wants them to, most vintage charts were arranged along two axes, wine region and vintage year, with some sort of a rating, usually on a numeric point scale assigned to each vintage year. A 100-point scale, popularized by Robert Parker in his Wine Advocate newsletter, is common, but any scale or rating system can work, and in addition to numbers or whatever else is used to rate the vintage, the entries may or may not be color-coded or contain additional information about the specific vintage year. So why all this interest with vintage? Well, the basic idea behind vintage is that there's a correlation between the quality of a finished wine and the quality of the grapes from which it was made, and that there's a correlation between the quality of the grapes and the weather during the growing season. And grape quality is especially correlated to the amount of precipitation and temperature during the growing season. In continental and maritime climates that are cooler and rainier than Mediterranean climates, a cold growing season can slow down ripening and delay the development of sugar in the berries, throwing the sugar ripeness of the grapes out of step with their phenolic or flavor development. And rain during the growing season can increase the chance of rot or other diseases, and if it happens close to harvest, it can increase the amount of water in the grapes, and then the grape must, leading to a watered-down wine. In the warmer, drier Mediterranean climates, it's excessive heat that you have to watch out for that would lead to premature sugar ripening of the grapes while flavor ripeness is still developing, leading to wines that are low on flavor but high in alcohol. So, generally speaking, so-called good years in continental and maritime climates are years that are a bit warmer and drier than average, with good years in Mediterranean climates being just a little cooler than the average. Also, generally speaking, vintage variation is a much bigger issue in continental and maritime climates, like Bordeaux and Burgundy, to take two famous examples, than it is in the Mediterranean climates, where weather patterns tend to remain more consistent from year to year. And if any of the terms that I'm using to describe climate are unfamiliar to you, check out my cast on climate and wine for some explanation of all of them. These days, there's a strong consumer expectation that there be a vintage date on a bottle of wine, at least on a still wine that wants to be taken seriously as a quality wine. Despite this, the value of assessing individual vintages for quality remains controversial. Why? Well, several reasons. First, it's important to be clear that money is at stake here, with most consumers willing to pay more, often substantially more, for a wine that they believe to be from a strong vintage that will increase in quality and value over time. A lot rides on identifying good vintages, and it's best for consumers if they can be identified earlier rather than later. So a lot of vintage assessment is done early, often before most of the wines in the vintage have been released. This early assessment leaves room for errors in judgment, even by experienced critics and wine professionals, and there have been quite a few vintages in different regions of the wine world that were either over or underestimated, sometimes drastically so, by the critics. Also, vintage assessments, especially those in chart form, that even at their most specific will just refer to a general area like Burgundy, can't capture the impact of all of the factors that might be specific to the site that the grapes for a particular wine in that region came from. For example, while a very rainy growing season in a region is good cause to be worried about overall grape quality, vines that are planted on stony, sloping soil that has good drainage are going to handle that extra precipitation differently than vines planted on flat land with poor drainage. An important point that doesn't come across from vintage charts or from a general statement about how good the vintage was. Also, once the grapes get into the winery, winemakers these days, even small independent winemakers, have a lot of resources, both in terms of techniques and technologies, at their disposal to help them finesse some of the problems posed by so-called bad vintages and still produce high-quality wines. And finally, what controlled research there is on the accuracy of vintage assessments hasn't tended to back up the idea that they're particularly accurate. In a paper delivered at a meeting of the Vineyard Data Quantification Society in 2001 that I'll link to in the information section of this video, Roman Weil of the University of Chicago presented research showing that with the exception of wines from Bordeaux, wine drinkers, both casual and very experienced, were unable to spot the difference in a blind tasting between a highly rated vintage and a poorly rated one. And that even for Bordeaux, where tasters could spot the difference between vintages with some consistency, they weren't able to pick which vintage was highly rated and which wasn't at rates greater than chance. In fairness, this is just one study, and there aren't many out there like it yet. So the picture may change as more data comes in. But for now, there's some reason to be skeptical of the claim that just because a vintage has been rated highly, even by experienced critics, that means that you or your guests will like it, especially if you taste it blind. So what do you do with all this information about vintages? Well, here's my advice. Even if it turns out that future research doesn't back up Dr. Weil's findings, you shouldn't just write off so-called bad vintages. Do some research and find producers with a reputation for quality in a given region, and then learn everything you can about all the sites that they source their grapes from, and how these sites might handle years with atypical weather. If you buy wines from producers like this made in so-called bad years, the fact is, thanks to the emphasis put on vintage assessment by consumers, you'll save some money, sometimes quite a bit of money, and still likely get a good wine. And if it turns out that Weil's findings are confirmed, well, that'll be interesting. Thanks for joining me for another Winecast. Like I said at the beginning, I'll be traveling for a couple of weeks, to Catalonia in Spain specifically. And while I won't be casting on YouTube while I'm there, I hope you'll follow my trip on Instagram at unknownwinecaster.drinks.wine. Thanks as always for checking out my casts and for taking the time to like, subscribe, and comment. And please do all those things if you enjoyed this cast or found it interesting and useful and haven't already. I'm your host, the Unknown Winecaster, and I'm out. Enjoy the grape, but always enjoy it responsibly.